Okay, so I am going to announce a bit of a change in format to these faction overviews before we get into this next one, which is on the High Elves, and that is that I'm going to cut them down a little bit because, to be quite honest, I just don't have the time to do the format that I was doing for the last two because it does take a deceptively long amount of time, and it's time that I just don't have now that the university has kicked in full force again, and I won't have that sort of time again until probably about 3 months' time. So I don't really want to put this on ice for 3 months because that's a little bit excessive, but I will still be doing these faction overviews, and the informative part of the videos with regards to mechanics are still going to be largely unchanged. But I will be dropping the lore parts of it because, quite honestly, it's only a very small part, and the campaign map isn't as important in Reforged anyway. So I think that that's the place where I can actually save a bit of time, and it's time that does need to be saved, otherwise I won't be able to make videos at all, because these faction overviews are really the only videos I have left to do on Reforged for the time being, other than battle replays and also showing off new units whenever they are released. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that, but now we'll get into the faction overview proper, which of course this time is the High Elves. So looking along the line here, you can see that the High Elves have been pretty decently expanded since vanilla. So some new units were necessary for the High Elves. I always felt their roster was a little bit limiting in what you could do. And indeed what they are best at has in fact changed. Before, both the Elven factions were pretty similar in the sense that your spears and your archers were really what you were relying on to get the job done in a field battle. Now though, the High Elves have switched over to being much more about their heavy infantry and heavy cavalry being of such high quality compared to the other factions, and that's what you'll be needing to do to win as the High Elves. The Sylvan Elves still remain largely the same in the sense that their spears and their archers are the centerpiece, whereas here with the High Elves, it is the heavy infantry and cavalry. So starting off at this end, we of course have the sword Quindi, or Quendi. They are largely unchanged from the vanilla version. They are, the lower tier of elven units. If you can call them low tier, they're more mid tier. It's all pretty expensive stuff for the elves, even at their cheapest units. They don't have the best armor. In terms of stats, they are a little bit more lacking now than they were, perhaps, because the more elite infantry is now more important, and the High Elves do have a bit of a discrepancy when it comes to costs. So, oftentimes you will be seeing the Sword Quindi just because the High Elves won't be able to field all of their best stuff, and the Sword Quindi is one of two units, well, three units, that could be considered affordable in the Elven sense. So you'll likely be seeing the Sword Quindi. They are deceptively good in melee despite their appearances, and really that's all there is to say. They're the same as in vanilla in terms of their overall power, I would say. Perhaps a little bit less powerful now that the elite infantry has taken a bit more precedence, but they are still deceptively good. Then we have the Mithlond Nobles. Now the Mithlond Nobles were some of the best infantry in vanilla, but they have been changed somewhat, in a similar way to the Iron Guard of the Dwarves has been changed. These guys have been nerfed to being essentially just a slightly higher than mid-tier unit. They are still very good, of course, but they are no longer the very, very high tier units that they once were in vanilla. They were the fifth best infantry unit in vanilla, I believe. Whereas now they are, falling in with the ranks, so to speak. They are still very, very good, though. They're going to beat the vast majority of mid-tier units from other factions. It's only elite infantry which they will struggle against. And they are still pretty expensive for what they are, so you do need to use them wisely if you don't want to waste your money. We also have another unit that's comparable, a little bit better than them, mainly because of their tougher, is the Lazarus Storm Guard. Of course, they look like Elder Enway units with sword and shield, and they are very, very good indeed. Again, just like the Mithlond Nobles, only a little bit better. They're also a little bit more expensive, but then all the High Elven units are expensive, so likely you're going to have to make some sacrifices in your army somewhere in terms of numbers, but the Enlarges Stormguard are still very, very good. The shields help them a lot in terms of the survivability of units, which I was always a bit critical of the High Elves of. In vanilla, all of their infantry seemed to die off a bit too quickly for my liking, or was prohibitively expensive, whereas the Enlarges Stormguard do solve some of these issues. But the star of the High Elven infantry still is the Smiths of Eregion. They are a very, very good infantry unit, one of the best heavy infantry units in this mod. If you don't count the dwarves, they could very well be the best, but I think Arnor and Gondor would have something to say about that. Armed with their hammers, they are of course armor piercing, which is very, very important. And yeah, they're all very, very expensive, the Smiths of Eregion, but they do need to be because of how good they actually are. So moving on then to the spears, which are still a very strong part of the High Elves, even if they aren't quite as dependent on them anymore. We have the standard Elder spears, which are the cheaper variant. They are very, very good, very survivable still, but they aren't quite as good as their elite variant over here, which has hit points. Slightly fewer men, but still enough to cause you pause. One of the best spear units in the game. These two will form a very strong defensive line, particularly in a siege. These guys can be very, very useful, or in a pitch, of course, because they're a little bit more maneuverable than the pikes, of which the High Elves do have some now. But yeah, the Elder spears were always a very, very good unit in vanilla. That's not changed in Reforged. They are still an excellent unit for the High Elves, very, very survivable, and will hold back a lot of infantry before they give way. There is also this unit which is very intriguing, which is the Falas Lords. Now, these guys have got 4 hit points, they're very, very strong, but there are only 33 of them, and in this variant of the mod, which is 0.7, they aren't quite worth it because of how few of them there are, but I do expect in the future that these guys will be buffed to the point where they are strong enough to be worth it in terms of a General's Bodyguard unit. So these guys are one to watch for the future because I'm sure that they will become very strong, because that is obviously the intention with a unit of this size and with that many hit points. So yeah, keeping an eye out for these guys, because I imagine they will either get more hit points or be given more stats or something to make them stronger. But yeah, they could potentially be one of the strongest units in the game, I feel. At least that, I think, is the intention. As for the shock infantry, well, the High Elves have 2, and it's very, very good. The Elder Swordsman has been buffed in vanilla. In vanilla, I was always a bit of a critic of these guys for dying too quickly. But now I think that they have gotten over that issue by having such a high attack score. They cause such damage to the enemy. They were able to beat several units that had hit points in the shock infantry list in order to gain entry there. And the Elder Swordsmen, they're pretty expensive, but they are worth it now, I would say. Very, very damaging, particularly if you find yourself on the attack as the High Elves in a siege, which is a bit of a strange role for High Elves to be playing, but these guys could very well turn into the most important unit you have in that situation, because they will be able to clear the walls very nicely. But the High Elves do have a better shock infantry unit, and that is of course the Cinderblade Masters. Only the Haven Guard are better than these guys when it comes to a two-handed unit. Very, very strong unit. Just enormous stats. Hit points, very damaging. Very difficult to beat. One-on-one, there may not be an infantry unit other than the Haven Guard that can actually defeat these guys. So, the Cinderblade Master is very, very impressive. Probably my favourite High Elven unit, honestly, with the possible exception of one which we'll get to later. The High Elves now have 2 long spear units, and of course one is the Linden long spears. They are essentially, well, I would call them cheap pikes, they're more middling pikes, to be honest with you. And again, this is another one of the affordable units that I mentioned earlier, like the sword Quendi. Cheap pikes, I've always been a bit of a fan of them because they can pay for themselves very, very easily. The problem that the Linden long spears have is they're maybe not terribly cheap, and also they have very limited armor. They're very easy to skirmish down, which of course is the pike's main weakness in terms of all of them, but the Linden long spears especially seem to have a bit of an issue with that, and especially seeing as they are still pretty expensive and there aren't very many of them. You need to use them wisely, but in a siege, if you need to save some money, these guys could be the answer, but personally, I'd be willing to splash the cash on your pikes as the High Elves because you have the Lazarus Guards, which are a very, very strong pike unit indeed. Much better armor, much better in melee. Yeah, the Lazarus Guards also, in terms of fashion, they clearly win. The High Elves look terrific, all of them, but the Linden long spears just can't match up to the Imagi Guards. So yeah, the Imagi Guards are very high tier pikes, and I do like pikes. And the third affordable unit that the High Elves have is the Bow Quindi. The High Elven archers have honestly seen the biggest nerfs of their army. Everywhere else I would say they've been given a buff, or at least remained on parity of what they were, like the spears. But the archers, they are no longer an archer-heavy faction. Arnor, the Sylvan Elves, and I think Dale as well. Well, actually, and even Harad, there are a lot of factions which are now better than the High Elves at range. It's not to say their archers are bad. The Bow Quindi are still a good lower tier archer with the amount of damage they do. The Nora warriors have been nerfed as well, at least in comparison to what they were originally. Their missile damage is now not as high as it as some of their contemporaries, but they are still pretty damaging. If you had the money to spend on them, they are essentially a range unit, like I said before, so potentially you might want these guys in your army, but I would say that you probably want to just skip these and go right onto the Elder Enway archers. These guys very nearly made it onto the list, but their lack of hit points in the end did cost them in a skirmish fight. But in terms of damage, they do 14 missile damage, which is very nearly as high as you can go, so this is still a very strong archer. Just keep in mind that in a skirmish fight as the High Elves are probably not going to be winning against the likes of the Sylvan Elves or Arnor or any of the really high tier archer factions now. You're going to have to be relying on your skill in melee more so than your skill at range, which I actually like. It differentiates the High Elves from the Sylvan Elves in a good way. Something else which differentiates the two factions is their cavalry. The High Elven cavalry is arguably the best in the game. You could say that Gondor and Rohan may have something to say about that. But for now, we'll look at the High Elves, and the Noratirno cavalry is the lowest tier of cavalry. You're seldom going to be seeing these guys because they're honestly not brilliant. Their stats are kind of lackluster, and also they're easily skirmished down. They don't have shields, for example. Still potentially good in a low funds game, but really you're not really going to be seeing these guys as much because it's the other three where the main event is, one of which is the Elder Enway Lancers. This will be probably the bulk of your cavalry. They don't have hit points, but they are still very damaging, and they will last quite a long time in melee against other cavalry. Pretty expensive, but honestly your cavalry is one area where you really want to be spending money, because it's an area where you can really gain an advantage over the enemy if you invest in it, and the Elder Enway Lancers are going to be the centerpiece of that. Very strong, very dependable, pretty much the same as they were in vanilla, only some units have now eclipsed them. Moving on to said units, one of which is the Elder Enway Nobles. A good General's Bodyguard unit, although I would be tempted to have these guys regardless of whether they carry your General or not because of how good they are. They may not have shields, but their armor is good enough that it doesn't matter, and their charge is very, very good indeed. The High Elven Cavalry tends to have a charge of 18, which is as high as you can get. So you're going to be able to decimate infantry with this, you're also going to be able to outlast a lot of enemy cavalry with this, and of course, at least when last I checked, the best cavalry unit in the game was the Lazarus Cavalry, these guys. They might have changed though, because there have been a couple of new cavalry units that have been introduced since then, and some of the stats have changed around. But I would imagine that the Lazarus Cavalry are always going to be at least top 5, maybe even always top 3 in terms of how powerful they are, which is only right because they are, they are very splendid looking. The Lazarus Armor is sort of a more muted version of the Elder Enway armor, which I do like. And finally, we have the Imladris Riders, which are a horse archer unit. Pretty expensive. The missile damage is maybe not worth it for what they are, but you could potentially gain a bit of an advantage if you use these guys to good effect in a cavalry fight. You can get in behind the enemy cavalry and shoot them in the back. That will lead to your cavalry having an even easier time of it than they were potentially already having. And they of course have access to a catapult and ballista as well, like every faction has, but there you are. That is the High Elves. Heavy cavalry and heavy infantry quality are their strengths. Their weaknesses, I would say, the cost of everything still. It is always going to be the weakness of the elves that you're going to have a smaller army than your enemy, and that can be used against you pretty heavily. Being overwhelmed is something which you can prevent by positioning your army well and using your cavalry to sort of break the enemy down. But ultimately there is still the danger that if the enemy manages to sort of disrupt your formation, you're always going to be fighting a losing battle at that point, because recovering as the High Elves is going to be difficult simply because you can't afford to make mistakes with how many men you have. But I do think that the High Elves are strong enough now in relation to what they were in vanilla that they are more than worth it, and one of the strongest factions in the game as it stands right now. And that will continue, I think, as the game evolves from what it is now. I believe that the High Elves will always be one of the strongest factions, as they should be. And I'm glad about that, because the High Elves are one of the best looking factions as well, and one of the most fun to play. So that was the High Elves. While some powers in Middle-earth may seem to be ever-present, there are others whose rise and fall can seem to be as rapid as the changing of the seasons. But that will be a story for another day.